I'm really pleased to have in the studio with me Danny Goldberg. Danny Goldberg is the president of Gold Village Entertainment, the author of several books, including How the Left Lost Teen Spirit, his most recent, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and The Hippie Idea. And Danny, and also I should say, you and I have some history. You hired me at Air America when you were the CEO of Air America Radio.
I did. One of the few positive accomplishments.
One of many positive accomplishments
that I can
you made.
Say from that era.
Yeah, I'd say your tenure there was kind of the high point of Air America.
Well,
and when you left, it really, but that's a whole nother story.
Whole other story.
Yeah. Anyhow, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and The Hippie Idea. Why the word idea?
Well, because the word hippie itself so quickly became drained of meaning. It was co-opted, as we used to say, by the media. It was the fodder of sitcom jokes, and it was associated with kind of stone buffoonery or dark figures like Charles Manson by people that were self-involved because of the ideal of it became such a media explosion that it was it was drained of meaning almost immediately. But my conceit is that even if you subtract long hair, love beads, even the music, the tie-dyed fashions, and some of the hippie slang, that there was a spiritual essence behind it that was what caused the magnetic attraction to begin with. And that idea to me still lives on. And, in simplistic terms, peace and love.
Yeah.
And without irony, without sarcasm, the idea of trying to bring those eternal values into a very complicated, technological, modernistic society, and to have a counterbalance to materialism, which to me has been the dominant religion of the West for my lifetime. And it included exploration with psychedelics. It included exploration with other spiritual traditions, such as Eastern traditions. But mainly it had to do with trying to identify oneself as a soul, not just in terms of the external roles. So I was really inspired by the combination of things that I graduated from high school in 1967, so this is not a memoir. It's like a journey to all the things in the culture that inspired me at the time that I wasn't quite cool enough to be part of yet. And it was a lot of darkness. It wasn't all peace and light, even though the middle-class economy was better.
Especially by the 70s.
Even in 67, there were 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and every male, of my generation up to the mid-30s was susceptible to the draft, 25 million people. There had been 20 or 25 million, over 20,000 American soldiers killed in Vietnam. By then, that number would more than double under the Nixon regime. There were the worst urban race riots since the Civil War. And we had a head of the FBI that makes Jim Comey look like Gandhi.
Right.
J. Edgar Hoover was extraordinarily venal, corrupt, had files on people, intimidated members of Congress and many presidents, and was hated the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement far beyond any rational security interests of the U.S. So there was a lot of darkness that younger people in the counterculture had to deal with, but there were a lot of inspiring things, both in music. First year that Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Pink Floyd, the Velvet Underground, Sly and the Family Stone, the Doors, and the Grateful Dead all released their debut albums that year.
Wow. First
year of FM rock radio really was created in the San Francisco area. I'm sure you were inspired in part by it.
I was doing an all-night progressive rock show in 68.
Right, by 68.
WKAR in East Lansing, Michigan.
Yeah, by 68 it becomes a national phenomenon. But up until the middle of 67, there was no such thing. FM used to be for farm reports and news and classical music. The year that Rolling Stone started publishing, the year of the Six-Day War in Israel, the year that Che Guevara was murdered. Interesting year. And of course, in the Vietnam protest movement and the civil rights movements were merged for some of us when Dr. King broke with the mainstream civil rights organizations and came out against the war in April of 67, which was only a few weeks after Muhammad Ali was convicted of draft evasion. And Ali, I think, at that point was the most famous person against the war in Vietnam.
Yeah. It was an extraordinary era. I was part of that, as I believe you were too, and I remember, I think it was in '67. Tim Leary sent a guy, might have been early '67. In fact, it was when acid was still legal, or it was just on the tail end.
Well, acid became illegal in most of the country in October of '66.
'66,
and that's why in '67 it proliferated, because of course once you make something illegal, it's much easier to get.
But my
like we
recollection,
learned in Prohibition.
Yeah, it might have been that year. I would have been 15 that year, and I was like only living at home half the time. I was living out at the paper office in East Lansing, where they published the underground paper. And this guy, Keith St. Clair, who Tim Leary had sent out to, he had 12 people that he sent around the country.
This was in Michigan?
This was in East Lansing, yeah.
Because it varied from state to state. California, I know, banned it in October, and by the next year it was but it might have been a brief window where it was illegal in California.
Yeah, he showed up with some incredible acid, and I took it, and we did it in the Methodist Church on Trowbridge Road. There were 12 of us, and we'd take acid and do this spiritual exploration. And then that, led me into the Maharishi and TM, and then that led me into the SDS. And by '68, I was, I'd gone from being totally spiritual to being largely political.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to focus on '67 instead of '68 or '69 was because '67 still, for me as a kid, and I think in the society writ large, there was a balance between kind of spirituality and protest. And that combination, to me, is what made it a special moment. And by '68, the darkness predominated. More anger in the protest, the murder of Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, the disturbances outside of the Democratic Convention. So I wanted to just go back a year to the brief ideal that I remembered and see how real it was. And I concluded there was a lot of reality to it. You talk about the Maharishi. The Beatles met the Maharishi in the summer of '67. Before that, the word meditation was not in tabloid newspapers. It was like maybe in religious studies departments of universities or monasteries. Suddenly, tens of millions of people heard about this idea called meditation. And I don't think that the world's ever been the same since. It became an alternative way of thinking about oneself for people that otherwise would never have even heard of it.
So what are, for part of this is like, a couple old hippies reminiscing here.
Correct.
But also, and there's probably a lot of the same, watching or listening, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who were not even alive in that era who are listening and watching.
Most people, one might say.
Yeah. And so what we're talking with Danny Goldberg. He's the author of a new book, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967 and the Hippie Idea. What is the message of your book for young people today?
Well, I've thought about it a lot, obviously. I finished the book right after the election. So most of the time I was writing it, it was history. After the election, I was confronted immediately with, well, what is what you asked? And I think of it from the standpoint of someone who's on the left and who is whether you call it a progressive, a liberal, Democratic socialist, certainly someone opposed to the policies of the Trump administration. And the question is not how do I feel, but how to be effective. And I think that a lot of the lessons from the '60s are what not to do as well as what to do. One thing to do is to honor the balance between, to me, the inner process and the outer, which you've always done as a human being and on your show, but which the left does not always do. Another is, Che Guevara said that when you ask the American left to form a firing squad, they get into a circle.
Right.
The self-destructiveness and the factionalism and tribalism between the Hillary people, the Bernie people, the Occupy people is a luxury we simply cannot afford. It undermined the protest movement in the '60s. Tom Hayden, shortly before he died, made a speech here in Washington. Tom Hayden, of course, being the great leader of one of the great leaders of the anti-war movement and original founders of SDS, or early presidents of SDS, author of the Port Huron Statement, said that they had promised themselves they wouldn't replicate the factionalism of the left in the '30s, and they failed to do that. They did replicate it. We can't do that. There has to be a way of honoring our differences between someone who believes that Bernie is right and we can have public college free for everybody, and people that may have supported Hillary Clinton who feel it's not practical right now. I'm on the Bernie side of that argument, but I am on the bigger side of the argument that we have to find ways of honoring, respecting each other within our community on the left, if we're then going to try to find a way of creating enough dialogue with enough of the Trump voters to topple this regime, because we can't do it ourselves, and certainly one little subgroup can't do it ourselves. Another thing to me to learn is the limits of polarization. The whole word counterculture, which I embrace and identified with and is one of the themes of the book, in retrospect, I don't think is the right way to think about it, because it's about being against something. And I asked Ram Dass, one of my heroes and one of the people I dedicated the book to, who's a spiritual teacher, as you know, wrote the great book, Be Here Now. Had originally been known as one of the Harvard professors who popularized LSD, and then
Richard Alpert,
went to as Richard Alpert, and I asked him if he thought there was more light than darkness in retrospect. And this was after the election. It was the last question I was able to ask and get into the book. And he said he thought there was more light than darkness, but that he felt that they had underestimated the damage that was done by polarization. When I was a kid, we used to divide people into heads and straights. Straight in those days meant not smoking pot or taking acid. I don't think people like being condescended to as being square or straight or uncool. I think that there has to be a way of asserting our values without dehumanizing other people, because the reaction that we get from it is simply a price we can't afford. So I think a lot of what happens in the polarization that we see today originates, I think, in the 60s. And even though it's a different technology era, it's a different media era, it's a different economic era, there are cosmic similarities in the way human beings relate to each other that we can learn from what to do and what not to do to try to, step back from the abyss that it seems like we're now facing. Certainly one similarity of now in the 60s, that did feel like an abyss then also. It was the threat of nuclear